A police officer and his loyal German shepherd were patrolling the frozen outskirts of Silver Creek when the dog suddenly froze, ears high, nose to the wind. Then came a faint, trembling voice carried by the blizzard. "Please, don't let them take me back." They followed the sound, and what they uncovered in the snow was a woman on the brink of death, carrying a secret that would expose a ruthless human trafficking ring. What happened next will break your heart and restore your faith in courage, loyalty, and second chances. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe that no one should ever be left behind in the cold, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear might just change the way you see the world. The blizzard had settled over Silver Creek like a living thing, restless, cold, and suffocating. Snow whirled through the air in tight spirals, clinging to the wooden storefronts along Main Street and burying the narrow roads that climbed toward the tree line. Street lamps cast cones of pale gold into the white haze, their light bending in the wind, while the faint hum of a generator from the police station was the only sound that broke the muffled quiet. It was the kind of night when no one in their right mind lingered outdoors, except for those who had to. Inside the station, Officer Ethan Cole adjusted the strap of his navy blue winter duty jacket and glanced toward the window. He was 38, broad-shouldered with the steady posture of a man used to long hours on patrol. His dark brown hair was kept short, though a few stray strands always seemed to fall over his forehead. Years of police work had carved faint lines at the corners of his steel-gray eyes, but there was still a warmth in them, a quiet patience that balanced the weight of his job. Ethan had joined the Silver Creek Police Department after a decade in Anchorage, seeking a slower life, though the small mountain town had a way of drawing trouble to its quiet streets. At his feet, lying on the rubber mat near the heater, was Ranger A, 5-year-old German shepherd with a coat of deep sable and black, thick enough to shrug off the cold but dusted now with stray flakes of melting snow from their earlier patrol. Ranger's amber eyes held a sharp, alert focus, the kind that missed nothing, and a faint scar ran along his right ear from a training accident years back. He was calm in most situations, but when he caught a scent worth following, there was no stopping him. To Ethan, Ranger wasn't just a partner, he was a lifeline in the field, a creature whose instincts had saved him more than once. The clock on the wall read 9:12 p.m. The storm had been raging for hours, and the radio crackled with intermittent chatter from nearby patrol units. Ethan was just pouring himself a second cup of coffee when the desk phone rang. Dispatcher Martha Keene, a stout woman in her late 50s with quick eyes and a voice that could cut through any chaos, answered from her booth. "Cole," she called. "Heads up, State Police just sent over a bulletin. 3 women missing from Pine Ridge City, last seen getting into a dark panel van near the transit station. Feds think it's tied to that trafficking case we heard about last month." She gave him a quick look, the kind that said she'd seen enough bad endings to know how these stories usually went. Ethan's brow furrowed, but before he could reply, Ranger's head snapped up. His ears pricked forward, and his nose twitched as if he'd caught a thread of something in the wind. Then, without warning, he let out a sharp, guttural bark once, then twice, louder each time. Ethan set down his coffee. "What is it, boy?" Ranger trotted to the door, glancing back at Ethan, his tail held stiff and low. The bark came again, but this time it carried urgency. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and the radio mic from the desk, sliding on his gloves. "Martha, I'm stepping out to check something. Keep the line open." The wind punched him in the face the moment he stepped outside, and snow crunched under his boots in deep layers. Ranger bounded ahead toward the edge of the parking lot, nose low, weaving back and forth until he hit on a direction. The world beyond the lot was a blur. White sheets of snow ripping sideways, pine trees bending under their icy load, visibility no more than 20 feet. Ethan followed, keeping the flashlight beam low to cut through the swirling snow. Ranger moved with purpose, every few steps stopping to sniff, then pressing forward again. After about 200 yards, Ethan caught the faint shape of the trail, a set of footprints, small and uneven, partly filled by the storm. They led toward the tree line. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, the storm's roar dampened by the thick pines. That's when Ethan saw the disturbance, a broken path through the snow where something, or someone, had stumbled through in desperation. His stomach tightened. "Ranger, steady," he murmured. The dog slowed, head down, sniffing the path. His tail flicked, and then he veered sharply left toward a cluster of fallen branches. Ethan swung the flashlight and the beam landed on a shape crumpled in the snow. It was a woman thin, her frame shaking under a tattered winter coat that was far too light for the weather. Her jeans were torn at the knees and her boots were missing entirely, bare feet raw and red against the snow. Strands of dark brown hair clung to her face, stiff with ice. Ethan knelt beside her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open pale green, glassy with exhaustion, and her lips moved, but the words were nearly lost in the wind. He leaned closer and caught a whisper. "Don't let them take me back." Her wrists, barely visible under the sleeves, were ringed with raw, chafed skin marks of rope or cuffs. "All right, you're safe now," Ethan said firmly, shrugging out of his heavy coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. Ranger sat beside them, his body blocking the wind as his amber eyes watched the dark tree line. "Name?" Ethan asked. "Claire," she managed. "Claire Donovan." He didn't press her for more, not here, not now. Scooping her into his arms, he turned back toward the station, Ranger trotting ahead, checking the path with every step. The woman was frighteningly light, and Ethan could feel the tremors racking her body through the layers of his coat. They reached the parking lot in under 10 minutes, though it felt longer. Martha opened the station door before they reached it, her face shifting from suspicion to shock. "Get her to the infirmary," she barked, already grabbing blankets from the shelf. As Ethan carried Claire inside, the radio on Martha's desk crackled again, an update from the state police. The dark panel van tied to the missing women, last seen heading toward the Silver Creek area just before the storm hit. Ethan glanced at Ranger, whose ears twitched as if he understood. The connection between Claire and that bulletin wasn't a matter of if. It was a matter of how soon they could piece it together. The infirmary at the Silver Creek station was little more than a converted break room with a cot, a metal cabinet of supplies, and a humming space heater shoved into the corner. Outside, the wind clawed at the walls, rattling the old glass windows, but inside it was warm enough for Claire Donovan's trembling to finally slow. She lay on the cot, her head propped up against a folded blanket. The heavy coat Ethan had wrapped around her now draped over the end of the bed. Her face oval, with high cheekbones that might have been striking under different circumstances, was pale and drawn, her lips still tinged blue from the cold. She looked younger than the 30 years she claimed to be, though the deep shadows under her eyes hinted at weeks without rest. Her dark hair, tangled and stiff from the snow, fell in uneven strands over her shoulders. Ethan stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching as Nurse Gail Porter, the station's part-time medic, worked. Gail was in her mid-60s, short and round-shouldered, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and reading glasses perched halfway down her nose. Her hands were steady, the product of decades in rural clinics, and her voice carried a matter-of-fact kindness that seemed to calm even the most panicked patients. She wrapped Claire's feet in warm towels, checking for signs of frostbite, and murmured, "You're lucky, dear. Another hour out there and we'd be talking about amputations." Ranger lay stretched out at the foot of the cot, his head resting on his paws, eyes never leaving Claire. Every so often his nose twitched, drawing in the scent of her clothes, cataloging it in the way only a trained canine could. At one point, his ears flicked and he gave a low whine, glancing at Ethan. Ethan crouched beside him, running a hand over his fur. "What is it, boy?" Ranger leaned toward Claire's jacket, sniffed again, then gave a short, quiet bark. Ethan frowned. Ranger's alert wasn't aggressive, it was investigative. Years on the job together had taught Ethan to read the difference. He leaned closer to the jacket draped over the chair and caught the faint chemical tang beneath the scent of wet wool and snow. "Gail, can you smell that?" he asked. She sniffed lightly, then shook her head. "Nothing but damp clothes to me." Ethan's jaw tightened. Ranger had picked up on something, most likely a sedative or tranquilizer residue, something common in abductions when victims were kept compliant. When Claire finally opened her eyes fully, she scanned the room like someone still expecting a threat to appear. Ethan kept his voice low. "You're safe here. My name's Officer Ethan Cole. That's Ranger. Can you tell me what happened?" Her gaze settled briefly on Ranger, and for the first time her expression softened. She reached out tentatively, and the dog lifted his head, allowing her fingers to brush against his fur. They grabbed me after work," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "I was walking to my car and this van pulled up. Someone got out, asked for directions. Then—" She trailed off, swallowing hard. "There was a cloth over my mouth. I woke up in the dark, in the back of a truck. There were other women there. I could hear them crying." Ethan kept his posture relaxed, letting the silence give her space to continue. "We were in there for, I don't know how long. Maybe a day, maybe two. The truck stopped sometimes. Men came in, counted us, gave us water. Then last night, we were moving again, but the driver lost control in the snow. I don't know if it hit something or just slid, but the doors flew open for a second. I ran. I didn't look back." Gail gently interjected, "Do you know where this was? Any landmarks?" Claire shook her head. "It was snowing, and I was so scared. I just ran toward the trees." Before Ethan could respond, the radio on his belt crackled to life. Deputy Alan Price came through, his voice slightly distorted by static. Alan was in his early 40s, tall and lanky, with a quick wit that sometimes rubbed city cops the wrong way, but he knew every back road within 50 miles. "Cole, you copy? We had a call from a farmer out on Route 6. He swears he saw a large white box truck idling by the tree line about an hour ago. Driver took off when he pulled up to check. No plates on the back. I'm thinking this might be our ghost truck." Ethan keyed the mic. "Copy that. Any direction of travel?" "Lost him in the storm," Alan replied. "Roads are a mess out here, but it was headed west, toward the state line." Ethan's mind was already working. The missing women from Pine Ridge City. Claire's escape. A box truck spotted in their jurisdiction. It was too many coincidences for one night. He glanced at Ranger, who had sat up now, ears forward, as if sensing the shift in the room. "Claire," Ethan said, keeping his tone measured, "the people who took you, did they say anything about where they were going?" Her eyes darted toward the door as if checking who might be listening. "One of them, he had a phone. I heard him say something about the border drop, and tonight being the last run." She clenched her hands together. "Please, you can't let them find me." "You're safe here," Ethan repeated, more firmly this time. Ranger gave a short, approving huff, as if agreeing with his partner. Gail finished her examination, satisfied there was no permanent damage from the cold, though Claire was clearly dehydrated and malnourished. She fetched a cup of warm broth from the kitchenette, setting it on the table beside the cot. Claire accepted it with both hands, sipping slowly. The storm outside roared again, rattling the station's old wood frame. Somewhere down the hall, the door to the evidence room slammed shut in the draft. Ethan's thoughts kept circling back to the truck sighting. West toward the border meant they could be across state lines by morning if someone didn't act fast. But, with the roads in their current state, chasing in the dark could end with them stranded, or worse. Still, one thing was certain. The people who took Claire weren't going to stop. And now, thanks to Ranger's nose, they had proof she'd been drugged. Likely the same method used on the others. That was evidence they could work with. As Gail checked Claire's blood pressure, Ethan moved to the corner of the room, keying the radio again. "Price, I want you to get with state troopers and set up a checkpoint on 17. If that truck comes through, I want eyes on it before it crosses the line." "On it," Alan said. Ethan turned back to Claire. "Rest for now. We'll take it from here." She looked at him for a long moment, then at Ranger, who had quietly moved closer to the cot. When she reached down, Ranger pressed his head into her hand, the steady weight of him a silent reassurance that she was not alone anymore. The wind howled against the glass, but inside the infirmary there was a fragile pocket of safety. For tonight, at least, Claire Donovan was no longer just a name on a missing persons list. The storm had eased by morning, though the cold had sharpened in its absence. Silver Creek lay under a hard, glittering crust of ice, the kind that crunched sharply beneath boots. The sun was pale and weak against the white expanse, doing little to warm the air. Ethan Cole stepped out of the station, pulling his navy winter jacket tight, his breath curling in steady clouds. Beside him, Ranger padded silently, nose already twitching as he tasted the air for something familiar. The German shepherd's dark sable and black coat gleamed faintly in the light, the thick ruff around his neck lifting slightly in the breeze. Ethan's plan was simple. Retrace the path where he'd found Claire the night before and see if anything had been left behind that might lead them to her captors. The snow might have buried some clues, but the freeze had also preserved others. Ranger had been restless all morning, moving from door to window, casting glances toward the forest. They were met at the edge of the trees by Forest Warden Samuel Briggs, a tall man in his late 50s with a weathered face and deep-set eyes. His heavy canvas coat was patched at the elbows, and his wide-brimmed hat was dusted with frost. Briggs was known in town for his dry humor and uncanny ability to spot animal tracks at impossible distances. "Cole," he greeted in his low, gravelly voice, "you might want to see this." He gestured toward a narrow game trail that wound into the woods. The trail was broken in several places where boot prints had frozen mid-step. Ethan crouched, brushing at the snow with gloved fingers. These weren't from last night too sharp, not filled in enough by the storm. "Recent," Ethan murmured. Briggs nodded. "I'd say within the last few hours. More than one set, maybe 3. Ranger moved ahead, weaving between the pines, until he stopped abruptly at a low branch. Ethan followed and sawed a scrap of gray-blue fabric caught on the bark, frozen stiff. The weave and color were unmistakable. It matched the lining of the thin coat Claire had been wearing. Ethan plucked it free, holding it up to the light. "She was dragged through here," he said quietly. Briggs's brow furrowed. "Could be where she broke away." They pushed on, Ranger leading the way with deliberate steps, pausing often to sniff the air or the snowpack. After about 20 minutes, the trail widened into a small clearing. In the center lay a discarded sheet of clear plastic industrial grade, stiff with cold, and a wooden crate half buried in drifted snow. The crate was weathered, with faded shipping labels, but one symbol stood out, a black circle enclosing 3 vertical lines, burned into the wood. Ethan tapped the mark with his glove. "You seen this before?" Briggs shook his head slowly. "Not around here, but it's not a freight company I recognize. Could be custom. Could be a mark they use to tag shipments." His voice dropped on the last word. Ethan took several photographs with his phone, then crouched to inspect the plastic. It was the kind often used to wrap pallets or cover cargo in transit. A few strands of dark hair were caught in a fold of the sheet. He carefully sealed them in an evidence bag. A rustle behind them drew Ethan's attention. Briggs turned too, hand going to the axe at his belt. Through the trees came Hank Doyle, a burly truck driver in his 40s with a weather-reddened face and a frame built from years behind the wheel and loading docks. His thick brown jacket was open at the collar, revealing a plaid shirt, and a layer of frost clung to his beard. "Heard you were poking around out here," Hank said, his voice carrying a mix of concern and curiosity. "What brings you out?" Ethan asked, straightening. Hank rubbed the back of his neck. "Ran into something last night on my way back from Milford. Stopped in a rest area near the state road, and I saw a couple of guys pushing a group of women toward an old box truck. Didn't like the look of it. Women were barely dressed for the cold, moving like they'd been walking for hours. I yelled over, but one of the men told me to mind my business. They loaded up quick and drove off." "Did you get a plate?" Ethan asked. Hank shook his head. "No, but I know where they went. Took the South Fork that leads toward that old lumber warehouse near the border. You know, the one been abandoned since the mill closed." Ethan exchanged a look with Briggs. That warehouse was only 15 miles away, close enough to cross into another jurisdiction in under an hour. Ranger had been circling the clearing as they spoke, his tail stiff. He stopped suddenly, nose pressed into the snow, and let out a sharp bark. Ethan moved to his side and saw faint tread marks wider than a pickup, more like a medium cargo truck. They curved out of the clearing toward the south, partially obscured by fresh powder but still discernible to Ranger's trained senses. Ethan stood, scanning the tree line. "They were here," he said. "Probably staged before moving to the warehouse. This crate, the plastic, it's all part of their operation." Briggs's expression darkened. "And if Hank's right, they're holding those women there now." Ethan looked down at Ranger, who met his gaze steadily, the fabric scrap still in Ethan's pocket as proof of Claire's desperate escape. "Then we don't have much time." They began the trek back, carefully marking the trail and securing the evidence. The snow squeaked beneath their boots, the cold pressing into every seam of their clothes. Overhead, the sun was already dipping toward the ridge, shadows stretching long across the white ground. By the time they reached the edge of town, Ethan had a plan forming, one that involved watching the warehouse without tipping off whoever was inside. But that would come later. For now, they had enough to confirm that Claire's story was part of something much bigger and much closer than anyone in Silver Creek had imagined. The interrogation room in Silver Creek's small station was a plain, square space with a table bolted to the floor, 2 metal chairs, and a buzzing fluorescent light that cast everyone's skin in a tired, pale shade. Outside, the late afternoon light was already fading behind the jagged mountain peaks, the air turning brittle with cold again. Ethan Cole sat across from Claire Donovan, a steaming mug of tea in front of her. She cradled it like it was the only source of warmth in the room. Her cheeks had regained a hint of color since the night they found her, but her eyes, green and haunted still, moved with the wary precision of someone who had lived too long looking over her shoulder. She hesitated at first, fingers tracing the rim of the mug. Ethan knew better than to rush her. Ranger lay on the floor beside his chair, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. The dog's ears twitched with every shift in her voice, every scrape of her chair against the floor. Finally, Claire spoke. "I saw his face." Her voice was quiet but certain. "One of the men guarding us. I recognized him." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "From where?" "From the news," she said, eyes narrowing as if replaying the image in her mind. "His name's Vargas, Raul Vargas. He runs, or used to run, a trucking company downstate. Everyone thought he was clean, but I remember reading an article years ago about a girl who disappeared. People suspected him, but nothing stuck, no charges." She swallowed hard. "He was the one who counted us, who told the others when to move us." Ethan's jaw tightened. Raul Vargas. He had heard the name in passing during his time in Anchorage, always whispered, always just beyond the reach of indictments. The man had a reputation for being untouchable, slipping through legal nets like water through fingers. Before Ethan could press further, the station door opened and Sergeant Tom Willis stepped in. Willis was in his late 40s, heavy-set, with thinning blonde hair and the kind of ruddy complexion that suggested a fondness for late nights at the bar. He'd been with Silver Creek PD for almost 15 years, known for his easy jokes and his ability to calm drunks without a fight. But Ethan had noticed something else since his transfer here, a tendency for Willis to take certain calls off the record, and a habit of changing subjects when specific cases came up. Willis gave Ethan a short nod, his small eyes flicking toward Claire before he turned his attention to a folder in his hands. "Just got a call from County. They want copies of last night's reports sent over ASAP," he said, his tone casual. Ethan nodded, but Ranger's head lifted suddenly, amber eyes locking on Willis. The shepherd's nose twitched, then his ears pressed forward. He stood, moving toward Willis in a slow, deliberate arc, tail rigid. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Ranger almost never reacted like this to people he knew, unless he recognized a scent he didn't like. The image from earlier flashed in Ethan's mind. The brown leather glove he'd bagged and tagged after finding it near the station perimeter the night they rescued Claire. Ranger had spent several minutes sniffing that glove, imprinting the scent. Now, he was reacting as if he'd just found the same trail. Willis looked down at the dog with a forced chuckle. "What's with him? Didn't forget to give him a treat, did I?" Ethan's voice stayed level. Ranger doesn't forget scents. Willis shrugged, muttering something about having reports to file, and left the room. Ranger stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching him go, before returning to Ethan's side. Claire's gaze followed Willis, her brow furrowing. "He smells like the gloves," she said softly, almost to herself. Ethan turned to her sharply. "What did you say?" "In the truck," she explained. "The men wore gloves like that. I remember the smell. It was chemical, like oil and something bitter." Ethan felt the knot in his stomach tighten. If Ranger was right, and Claire's memory matched, then someone inside their own department had been close enough to that glove for the scent to transfer. And if that someone was Willis, the implications were ugly. Still, Ethan kept his expression neutral. "You're sure it was Vargas?" he asked, steering her back to her original point. "Yes," Claire said firmly. "He's got a scar across his jawline right here." She traced a line along her own face. "It's faint, but under certain light you can see it. He used to touch it when he thought no one was looking. He did it while he was counting us." Her voice trembled on the last word, and she pulled the mug closer, as if it could anchor her to something solid. Ethan scribbled notes in his pad, the pen moving in quick, deliberate strokes. Vargas, a scar on the jaw, trucking company, suspected in past disappearances. And now, possibly linked to a warehouse near the border holding trafficked women. Outside, the wind carried the muffled sounds of chains on tires as a snowplow rumbled past. The storm might have passed, but the cold had settled deep, and the town's streets gleamed with frozen ruts. Inside the interrogation room, the air felt heavier than it had all morning. Ethan closed his notebook and stood, signaling to Ranger. "We're done for now, Claire. Get some rest. We'll keep you safe." She gave a small nod, though her eyes lingered on the door Willis had used to leave. As Ethan stepped out into the hallway, Ranger padded silently beside him. The dog's steady presence was a reminder instincts didn't lie, and tonight, those instincts had just pointed them toward a danger much closer to home than Ethan had anticipated. The plan was dangerous, but in Ethan's mind, there was no other way to flush out the traitor. If Sergeant Willis was feeding information to Vargas, news of Claire being moved to a safe location would be irresistible bait. The story had to look authentic. Just 2 officers and a canine escorting her through the back roads, away from the station's security. And then they would see who came hunting. By late afternoon, the weather had shifted again. Heavy gray clouds pressed low over Silver Creek, the wind carrying fine crystals of snow that stung the skin. The temperature had dropped fast enough to make breath freeze against scarves and hoods. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter, guiding Claire toward the department's older SUV parked in the alley behind the station. Ranger waited in the back compartment, his eyes sharp and restless. Claire was dressed warmer now, a thick parka borrowed from the evidence locker, insulated boots, and a wool cap pulled low over her ears, but her shoulders were tense beneath the layers. "You're sure this is going to work?" she asked, her voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around her mouth. "It will," Ethan replied, checking the rifle secured in the back. "But you need to trust me and stay close to Ranger." The third person in the vehicle was Officer Lena Hayes, a young patrol officer in her late 20s with auburn hair pulled into a tight braid and a determined look in her hazel eyes. Hayes was known for being sharp on the radio and faster on her feet. She'd grown up in Silver Creek, daughter of a logger, and carried herself with a quiet toughness shaped by the mountains. She had volunteered for this assignment without hesitation. They set out just before dusk, taking the south route toward the foothills. Snow swirled across the narrow road, hiding patches of ice beneath. Ethan kept his headlights low, using the fog lamps to cut through the curtain of white. The radio on the dash hissed with static, the storm already playing havoc with the signal. About 20 minutes in, Ranger's ears pricked. From the back, he shifted his weight forward, his amber eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the side window. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan felt it before he heard it, that instinctive ripple of alertness he'd learned never to ignore. "Talk to me, boy," Ethan murmured, glancing in the rearview mirror. Ranger's gaze didn't waver, and seconds later, headlights flared in the distance behind them. too bright, too fast. Hayes turned in her seat. "We've got company." The SUV accelerated, tires crunching over the snowpack, but the pursuing vehicle. A black pickup with no plates closed the distance quickly. Ethan swung the wheel, turning onto a narrow logging road flanked by towering pines. The snow here was deeper, the wind slicing through in sharp gusts. The radio squawked once, then died completely. "They've jammed us," Hayes said grimly. The truck's engine roared as it came up alongside them, and before Ethan could react, shapes moved in the bed, 3 men in heavy parkas, faces masked, rifles slung across their chests. One banged a fist on the cab roof and jumped down into the snow, blocking their path. Another leapt toward the rear door, grabbing the handle. Ethan slammed the brakes, the SUV skidding to a halt. "Hayes, with me!" he barked, throwing open his door. The cold bit instantly through his gloves. Shots cracked through the trees, muffled by the snow, but close enough to send splinters from a nearby pine. In the back, Ranger exploded into motion. The rear hatch flew open under Ethan's hand, and the German Shepherd hit the ground running, his powerful legs churning through the drifts. One of the masked men had grabbed Claire's arm, trying to drag her toward the pickup. Ranger's snarl ripped through the wind, and he lunged, clamping his jaws around the man's forearm. The attacker screamed, stumbling backward into the snow. Ranger held him there, twisting just enough to force the rifle from his grip. Ethan moved fast, seizing the opportunity. He tackled the second gunman, driving him into the snowbank and wrenching the weapon away. Hayes, quick and precise, disarmed the third with a baton strike to the wrist, sending his rifle clattering across the ice. The man under Ranger thrashed, trying to kick free, but the dog's grip was iron. Snow sprayed as Ranger shifted his weight, forcing the attacker's face into the drift until Ethan could cuff him. "Good boy," Ethan said sharply, tugging Ranger back by the harness once the man was secured. Claire scrambled back toward the SUV, Hayes keeping close. Her eyes were wide, breath coming in quick bursts. "That was them," she said. "The same voices, I know it." The storm thickened, snow falling in heavy sheets that blurred the outlines of the trees. The black pickup's driver had already turned tail, tires spinning as he reversed down the road, vanishing into the curtain of white before Ethan could line up a shot. They bound the 3 captured men and loaded them into the SUV, but Ethan knew the real win tonight wasn't in the arrests. It was in the confirmation. The traitor had passed along their movements, and the enemy had walked right into their trap, and Ranger had been the wall that kept Claire from vanishing back into the dark. The 3 masked men captured in the trap sat shackled in the holding cells, silent except for the occasional cough or the scrape of a boot against concrete. Outside, the wind keened through the narrow alley behind the station, carrying a faint scent of diesel and snowmelt. Ethan Cole stood in the observation room, arms crossed, watching through the one-way glass as Detective Marla Jensen worked on the youngest of the suspects. Marla was in her early 40s, a lean woman with sharp cheekbones and chestnut hair cut into a chin-length bob. She had a reputation for knowing exactly when to lean in and when to let silence squeeze the truth out of someone. Years ago, she'd been nearly killed during a drug bust gone bad, a scar along her right wrist the only visible reminder. Since then, her patience had hardened into something almost surgical. She never wasted words, and she never bluffed without leverage. The suspect, wiry, maybe mid-20s, kept his head down until Marla slid a printed photo across the table. Ethan recognized it. Sergeant Willis at a local bar, beer in hand, and beside him, Officer Grant Miller. Miller was in his late 30s, tall and solidly built, with dark hair always combed flat and a square jaw that gave him a deceptively dependable look. He had been in Silver Creek PD for nearly a decade, the kind of officer who smiled easily and remembered everyone's coffee order. To most, he seemed harmless. The suspect's eyes flicked toward the photo and then away. "I don't know him," he muttered. "Funny," Marla said lightly, tapping the edge of the photo, "because your phone does. That's Miller, and it just so happens his number is saved in your contacts under B." She leaned back, letting the words sink in. "B for boss? Buyer? Or maybe betrayer?" By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, Miller was sitting in the same chair the suspect had occupied hours earlier. His uniform looked freshly pressed, his badge polished, but his eyes darted too quickly. Ethan entered the room with Ranger at his side, the dog's nails clicking softly against the linoleum. "Want to explain why your number's in the phone of a man who tried to abduct a protected witness?" Ethan asked, his voice level but carrying an edge. Miller shifted in his seat. "I don't know what you're talking about. People get numbers mixed up." Ranger suddenly stood, ears forward, nose working the air. Without prompting, he moved toward Miller, circling once before stopping at the man's right side, nostrils flaring. Then, with a low growl, Ranger turned and padded to the door. Ethan understood instantly. "Hold him," Ethan ordered Marla, before stepping into the hallway. Ranger led him straight to the evidence room. Inside, the scent of cleaning solvent hung in the air. Ranger went directly to a locked cabinet, sniffing along the bottom edge before sitting down hard, looking up at Ethan. The lock showed fresh scratches. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He used his key to open it and found one of the evidence bags from the Vargas case missing. The logbook confirmed it had been checked in, but there was no record of it being signed out. Back in the interrogation room, Ethan dropped the empty slot label from the bag onto the table. "You've been in the evidence room," he said to Miller, "and you didn't sign the log." Miller's face paled, but he tried to recover. "I was looking for a file. That bag you took?" Ethan cut in. "It had Vargas's glove in it, the same one Ranger smelled on you the other day." Something in Miller broke then. He slumped forward, hands clasped. "You don't understand," he said hoarsely. "They would have killed me. Vargas, he's not just moving people. He's got friends everywhere. He paid me to feed him schedules when the patrols were thin, when your witness was vulnerable. And tomorrow—" He hesitated, glancing toward the glass. "Tomorrow night, they're moving a big shipment. Women? Through Silver Creek, then across the border before dawn." Ethan's stomach knotted. "Where?" Miller shook his head. "I don't know exactly. They keep it moving until the last minute, but the drop is somewhere close enough they can vanish before anyone can react." Ranger huffed, a short sound that broke the tense air. Ethan looked down at the dog and felt the familiar clarity that came before a storm. They had their mole, and now they had a ticking clock. The old lumber warehouse squatted like a shadow at the edge of the state border, its corrugated steel walls streaked with rust, its high windows long since shattered and boarded over. The moonlight was dimmed by a fast-moving layer of clouds, but enough light spilled through to illuminate the fresh tire tracks leading to the loading bay. A biting wind carried the smell of oil, wet wood, and something sharper fear. Ethan Cole crouched behind a stack of abandoned pallets with Ranger at his side. The German shepherd's breath steamed in the frigid air, his ears pricked and eyes fixed on the shadowed figures moving near the bay doors. Across from them, members of the state's Special Response Team positioned themselves, their dark uniforms blending with the skeletal outlines of the surrounding trees. The SRT leader, Captain Dwight Harmon, was a barrel-chested man in his 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and a voice like gravel. His leadership style was all economy, no wasted words, no wasted time. He tapped Ethan's shoulder once and mouthed, 2 minutes. Ethan's gaze followed the movement at the bay. Raul Vargas stepped into view, his heavy parka unzipped despite the cold. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with a scar slashing faintly along his jawline, just as Claire had described. His dark eyes scanned the yard with the confidence of someone who had eluded law enforcement for years. Beside him, 2 armed men herded a line of women 7 in total toward a waiting box truck with its rear doors yawning open. Their heads were down, shoulders hunched against the cold, hands bound loosely in front of them. Inside the warehouse, Claire Donovan was already moving. Against Ethan's protest, she had insisted on coming. The women in there would trust her faster than any stranger in a badge. She wore dark, unmarked winter clothes, her hair tucked under a knit cap, her pale face set with determination. In the shadows of the warehouse interior, she crouched near a side wall, waiting for Ethan's signal. Ranger's nose twitched, his head swinging toward the east side of the building. Ethan followed the line of his gaze there, half hidden in shadow, a lone guard patrolled near a locked side door. If Vargas had more captives inside, that door was the most likely access. The radio in Ethan's earpiece crackled softly with Harmon's voice. "On my mark. 3, 2, 1, go." Ranger sprang forward before Ethan even finished his first stride. The shepherd covered the distance in seconds, his paws silent on the frozen ground. The guard barely had time to turn before Ranger's jaws clamped around his arm, dragging him off balance. The rifle in his grip clattered to the ground. Ethan closed in, yanking the man down and securing zip ties around his wrists in one fluid motion. With the guard neutralized, Ethan shoved the side door open and slipped inside. The air was colder here than outside, a stale mix of dust and metal. Ranger moved ahead, his nose working furiously, leading them down a short corridor lined with empty storage rooms. At the far end, he stopped in front of a heavy padlocked door and began barking sharply, the sound echoing off the metal walls. Ethan's bolt cutters made quick work of the lock. He swung the door open to reveal 5 women huddled together on the concrete floor, their faces pale and eyes wide. They flinched at first, then relaxed when Ranger padded forward with a soft whine. Ethan spoke low and steady. "You're safe now. We're getting you out." Back in the main yard, the SRT had moved in fast. Harmon's team engaged Vargas's men with precision, shouts and the thud of boots breaking the frozen air. Vargas himself turned to retreat toward the truck, but found Ethan blocking his path, Ranger at his heel. The 2 men locked eyes, a silent recognition of the chase that had finally ended. Meanwhile, Claire slipped through the chaos inside the warehouse, guiding the original group of women toward a narrow service door. "This way," she urged, her voice steady but urgent. The cold air bit hard when they stepped outside, but ahead lay a van driven by Deputy Alan Price, engine running, ready to ferry them to the safe house arranged earlier that day. Ethan moved Vargas against the wall, cuffing him while Harmon's team secured the yard. Ranger stayed close, his gaze scanning for any movement. As Ethan led Vargas toward the waiting SRT vehicle, he caught sight of Claire at the van door, helping the last woman inside. She glanced back, meeting his eyes for a brief moment that held gratitude, relief, and the knowledge that tonight, at least, they'd won. The wind shifted, carrying away the last shouts and the crunch of boots on ice. The warehouse loomed silent again, but its shadow no longer hid the people it had stolen. The snow had stopped 2 days ago, leaving Silver Creek wrapped in a bright, deceptive calm. Sunlight spilled across rooftops and glinted off the frozen river that cut through the edge of town. The cold was still sharp, but it carried none of the danger it had during the blizzard. It felt cleaner now, like the air itself had been scrubbed clear. Inside the courthouse, the mood was very different from the icy stillness outside. The main chamber was filled to capacity uniformed officers, local officials, townspeople who had followed the case from whispers to headlines. The trial for Raul Vargas and the remnants of his trafficking ring had moved fast. With the women rescued, the physical evidence from the warehouse, and Miller's recorded confession, the prosecution's case was airtight. Miller sat at the defense table, his police badge already turned in, wearing a plain gray suit that hung a little loose on his frame. He stared at the floor most of the time, avoiding the eyes of the people he had worked beside for years. His wife, a short woman with auburn hair and a guarded expression, sat in the back row with her arms folded tightly, her gaze fixed anywhere but on him. Across the aisle, Claire Donovan was seated between 2 U.S. Marshals. She looked different now, still pale, but her posture had straightened and her green eyes held more clarity. Her hair had been trimmed and washed, the knit cap replaced with a soft wool beret. The Witness Protection Coordinator, Agent Meredith Shaw, sat just behind her. Shaw was in her early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered with salt and pepper hair tied into a tight bun. Her calm, deliberate way of speaking carried the kind of authority that made people listen. She had seen too many witnesses lose faith in the system. It was her job to make sure Claire didn't become one of them. Ethan Cole stood in the back of the room, his dress blues pressed crisp, a silver bar pinned above his badge. Beside him sat Ranger, brushed to a glossy sheen, his sable and black coat catching the light. The dog sat tall, watching the proceedings with the kind of composed focus that made people whisper. When the judge read the final verdict, guilty on all counts for Vargas, the same for his men, and a separate conviction for Miller on charges of conspiracy and aiding a criminal enterprise, the room let out a collective breath. It was over. The biggest trafficking case in Silver Creek's history had been closed. Later that afternoon, the town gathered in the community hall for a ceremony. Folding chairs filled the space, and the air smelled faintly of wood polish and the coffee brewing in the corner. Mayor Harold McKenna, a wiry man in his 60s with a booming voice and a smile that could win over even his political rivals, took the stage. "Today," he began, "we honor the men, women, and one extraordinary partner who stood between our community and a darkness we could not see." Ethan was called up first. The mayor pinned a medal to his chest, a silver star surrounded by a ring of etched laurel leaves. The applause was loud, warm, and it felt like it came from the whole town. But when Harold called Ranger forward, the sound doubled. The shepherd stepped onto the stage beside Ethan, his ears up and eyes scanning the crowd. The mayor knelt to place a wide ribbon around his neck, from which hung a polished medallion engraved with the words, "Guardian of the Blizzard." Camera flashes popped, and someone in the crowd shouted, "Good boy, Ranger!" prompting laughter and cheers. Claire was the last to step forward. She wore a dark blue coat and a simple scarf, but in her hands was something bright, a knitted scarf in a deep, rich green. She knelt in front of Ranger, fastening the scarf loosely around his neck. "This is for you," she said softly, her voice carrying in the quiet that had fallen over the hall, "for finding me, for keeping me alive, and for giving me back my freedom." Ranger's amber eyes softened, and he pressed his head lightly against her hand before stepping back to Ethan's side. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of handshakes, photographs, and the low hum of conversation. Outside, as the crowd began to disperse, the winter sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. Claire stood with Agent Shaw at the edge of the steps, looking toward the road that would take her away to a new name, a new life. She caught Ethan's gaze and gave a small nod. Gratitude and farewell in one. Ethan looked down at Ranger, who stood quietly beside him, the green scarf bright against his coat. "Come on, partner," he murmured. "We've done our part." As they walked away, the sounds of the town rose behind them. Laughter, the creak of doors opening, the normal rhythms of life returning. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the weight in his chest ease. The storm had passed, and in its wake light had returned to Silver Creek. Sometimes, the greatest heroes don't wear uniforms or speak our language. They walk on four paws, guided by loyalty, courage, and a heart that knows no fear. Ranger wasn't just a police dog. He was a protector, a guide, and a bridge between danger and safety. Without him, Claire and the other women might never have been found. His instincts, his unwavering focus, and his willingness to risk himself for others became living proof that God's miracles can arrive in unexpected forms. In life, we often pray for signs, for help, for deliverance. Sometimes that answer comes through a person, and sometimes it comes through a faithful animal sent at just the right time. Just as God placed Ranger in Claire's path that night, we too can be placed in someone else's path to protect, to comfort, to rescue. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that miracles still happen. Leave a comment to tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe that God uses even the smallest and furriest of His creations to do great things, type Amen in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that prove faith, love, and courage still shine in our world. May God bless you and your loved ones always.
"You're wasting your life waiting for something that isn't coming back," the man snapped, slamming the back gate shut behind him, but the dog didn't flinch. She sat like a statue, legs tucked beneath her, tail curled against the sand, eyes fixed on the shimmering water as if it owed her an answer. The tide rolled in slow and steady, licking the shore with a rhythm older than sorrow. Wind tangled through her sun-faded collar. She blinked once, and kept staring. Locals had started whispering about her weeks ago. The sea dog, they called her, a black and tan shepherd mix with one torn ear, a patch of white fur on her chest, and a gaze so unblinking it unsettled even the old fisherman. Every morning, just after dawn, she'd appear on the same dune near the lifeguard station, settle into the same patch of sand, and stare at the ocean for hours, motionless, alert, haunted. No collar, no tag, no leash, just a stare like a waiting room where grief and hope sat in the same chair. And then there was the man. Jonas Ray. 50-8, retired dive instructor, lived in a weathered cottage just off the boardwalk, close enough to smell salt even when the wind died down. He'd tried to ignore the dog for days, said it was just looking for scraps, said it'll move on. But the truth was, every time he passed her on the way to his morning coffee, something inside him flinched. He knew that look, that it was the same look his wife had worn in the hospice bed when her eyes drifted past him, waiting for someone who wasn't there. He hated that look, so when the dog started showing up at the water's edge just beneath his deck, always at the same hour, always silent, always still, he snapped, tossed a leftover sandwich at her once. She didn't even blink, said suit yourself, and walked back inside. Then one morning, after a restless night and a dream he couldn't shake, he followed her, just followed. She walked slowly, deliberately, like she was being pulled by something deeper than instinct. The beach was quiet, the sky bruised with early morning cloud. Gulls circled overhead, sharp cries knifing through the hush. She led him past the lifeguard tower, past the rock pools, down the broken path to the inlet where the water darkened, and then she sat. Again. Jonas stood a few feet behind, arms folded, watching her, watching the sea. The silence was thicker out here, denser. He felt it in his chest. Something in the air was wrong. He tried to shake it off. You know, I taught diving for 26 years, he muttered to no one, mostly to fill the space. Thought I'd seen everything the ocean could throw at a man. Hurricanes, blackwater currents, jellyfish the size of fridges, even found a wedding ring stuck inside a grouper once. The dog didn't move. He sighed, turned to leave, and then he saw it. Just for a second, flash beneath the water, maybe 30 feet out, not a wave, not a dolphin, something slower, smoother like silk sliding across dark glass. He froze. By the time he blinked it was gone. He glanced back at the dog. Her ears were up now. She had seen it too. The hairs on Jonas's neck lifted. 2 hours later, he was sitting in the harbor cafe, stirring coffee that had gone cold. His hand hovered over his phone, hesitant. Call the Coast Guard for what? A dog that liked to stare at waves, a shadow in the surf. He almost laughed at himself, but he didn't. Instead, he pulled out the old satellite map of the inlet, the one he'd used to train students on currents and terrain shifts. There was a spot near the dog's perch, a drop-off trench, sharp and sudden, unusual for a coastline this flat. A memory floated back, something barely there. Years ago, during a training dive, one of his students had panicked mid-dive near that same trench, swore she'd seen something big moving in the gloom. Jonas had written it off his nerves. Now he wasn't so sure. By noon, he'd made the call, not to the Coast Guard, to his old crew. Bring the gear, he said into the phone. You'll want the sonar too. By dusk 3 divers were suiting up on the rocks. The sky had cleared into a soft amber hue, and the tide had started to rise. The dog was there, sitting exactly where she had always sat, unmoved by the commotion, eyes still on the same spot. She's pointing at something, muttered Elsie, the youngest diver. I swear it. Jonas just nodded. They descended as the light began to fade, the sea swallowing them in a hush that felt ancient. 15 feet, 20, 30. The trench opened below like a mouth, and then the sonar pinged. Something solid, not rock, not coral, made in close when they surfaced. 30 minutes later, Jonas looked different. His face was pale, jaw tight. The other divers followed, unusually quiet. No jokes, no laughter, not even the usual post-dive chatter. Just wide eyes and long silences. What is it? Someone asked from the rocks. Jonas didn't answer. He looked back toward the dune, but the dog was gone. Vanished, as if her watch had ended, and beneath the surface, something waited. Something that would turn whispers into headlines by morning. The wind picked up that night, sharp and restless. It rattled the blinds on Jonas's porch and sent sea spray hissing against the windows. He stood in his kitchen, staring at the dive camera's cracked monitor, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as he rewound the footage again. And again each time, the screen flickered with the same surreal image, a dark shape resting at the bottom of the trench, half consumed by silt and tangled kelp. Its frame was unmistakably human-made, metal beams twisted like ribs, windows long shattered, algae blooming in the corners like rot on bone. A small vessel, maybe 25 feet in length. No identification, no registration. Buried too deep to have come in recently. And there, at the base of the wreck, something else. A collar, a red dog collar, faded and fraying, caught on the fractured edge of a railing. Jonas hadn't said a word to the others. Not yet. Not until he was sure. He leaned forward, pausing the footage. The collar had something attached, maybe a tag or a tracker. The resolution was grainy, but the color jolted something deep in his memory. Red, like the leash that had once hung in his garage for months after Daisy, his daughter's dog, went missing 3 years ago. Daisy had vanished during a family vacation to a beach town up north. Vanished without a trace. He closed the laptop and pressed his palms to the counter. The wind moaned through the cracked window frame. The ocean somewhere beyond heaved like something alive. The next morning, he was back on the beach before sunrise. The world was quiet in that way it only is when grief shares space with fog. No birds, no joggers, only the soft push of waves and the hiss of sand shifting beneath his boots, and no dog. She was gone. Not just from the dune, but from the town. No sightings, no prints, not even a trace of fur where she'd laid every day. It was as if the moment Jonas had found the wreck, her part in the story had ended. But Jonas didn't believe in coincidence anymore. He went to the harbor office first, asked for missing vessel reports, wreck logs, anything. The clerk, a man with more rust on his elbows than the boats he charted, narrowed his eyes when Jonas showed him a frame from the dive footage. "Looks like the Gloria May," he said after a moment. "Went down 6 years ago. Storm hit just as she was leaving port. Never found her. 2 people on board, father and daughter, no survivors." "Was there a dog?" Jonas asked. The man blinked, like the question had caught on something inside him. "Yeah, the kid had one. Brown Shepherd mix. Search teams said she probably drowned." Jonas turned away, the pieces slotting into place like cold teeth. A girl, a dog, a wreck that was never found until now. Until that dog led him to it. He needed to go back down. He called Elsie and Marco, the only 2 from the original dive team he trusted enough to help. They met at the harbor before noon. Tension strung tight between them. The others had heard rumors already. Divers talk, even when they're afraid. "You sure you want to do this?" Marco asked as they checked their gear. "Last time felt wrong." Jonas zipped up his suit. "I need to know what's down there." They descended mid-afternoon, the sun glaring on the surface before slipping away into the gray. Visibility was worse this time. Currents had shifted, silt clouded everything. The trench yawned open beneath them, and as they reached the edge, the wreck came into view. But it wasn't untouched anymore. The collar was gone. In its place, scratched into the sediment-covered hull in fresh, almost deliberate marks, was something none of them spoke of aloud. 3 letters, Eli. Not a name Jonas recognized, but Elsie did. Her eyes widened in her mask. "My brother's name," she said when they surfaced, pale as foam. "He drowned 6 years ago in a boating accident in Florida. His dog was never found." Jonas didn't speak for a long time, because the dog that had sat on the shore day after day hadn't been just one dog. She had been many, or perhaps they had always been the same, drawn to the wrecks that never got closure, to the people left wondering, to the sea's silence where too many names were swallowed and too few were spoken again. And now she was gone. But the message was clear. The sea never forgets. It just waits for someone to finally look. Jonas hadn't slept. Not really. He'd laid down, shore boots still on, wet gear in a heap by the door, dive log open on the table like a wound. But his eyes stayed open. Even in the dark he could still see it, those blinking sonar readings, that ghostly mass resting beneath the trench shelf. Man-made, metallic, large, buried under years of silt and silence. And the dog, gone. He kept telling himself it was a coincidence. That dogs wander off. That maybe she had finally gotten tired of waiting for a ghost. But some part of him, a part he couldn't name and didn't want to, knew better. The moment they'd surfaced from that dive, she had vanished. As if her job was done. As if she'd been waiting for them to find it all along. By sunrise he was back at the inlet with a thermos in hand and a restless edge in his gut. The sea looked different now, not calmer, just quieter, like it was holding something back, like it knew a secret and was daring him to ask. Elsie arrived not long after, her wetsuit half-zipped and her eyes wide with a question she hadn't yet dared to voice. "You really gonna open it?" she asked. Jonas didn't respond at first. He just stared at the tide, rising fast now, curling over the rocks like it had somewhere to be. "Not yet," he finally muttered. "But we need answers." By noon, the rest of the crew had returned. They brought equipment Jonas hadn't touched in years: underwater cutting tools, recovery lines, waterproof cameras, old gear for a new mystery. No one said it out loud, but the air was different around them, tense with the weight of something unspoken. They dove again. This time visibility had dropped. A fog of disturbed sand hovered like smoke underwater, stirred by yesterday's discovery. As they approached the trench edge, the shape below emerged slowly, bigger than they thought, and older. A cylindrical form, long and narrow, half swallowed by time. Jonas swept a hand over the surface, brushing away debris. His glove passed over what looked like a nameplate, worn down by decades of salt. He brought the light closer. Letters emerged beneath the grime: Evangeline. He froze. A cold ripple moved through his chest, his pulse slowing with it. That name, it belonged to a vessel that had vanished 23 years ago off this very stretch of coast. No survivors, no wreckage, just a distress call caught in fragments, never traced. Jonas remembered the story well. He'd been on another dive boat that same week, had heard the radio traffic firsthand. Evangeline, a private research vessel, 6 crew, 1 civilian passenger. The civilian had a dog, a black and tan shepherd. He surfaced fast, pulling off his mask before his feet hit sand. The sky looked sharper somehow, more urgent. Every gull cry felt like a warning. He didn't wait. For the others, he ran back to the harbor cafe, heart hammering, memory buzzing like static. It took 15 minutes to find the article. He knew the name of the civilian passenger, Claire Hallberg, 28, marine biologist. She'd been investigating undersea fault lines when Evangeline disappeared. There was only one photo of her that circulated with the case. She was smiling with a dog at her feet. Same torn ear, same white patch, same unblinking eyes. Jonas sank into the cafe bench, staring at the photo like it might rearrange itself. How? He whispered. How is that dog still alive? He didn't have time to think, because outside, down the boardwalk, came the sound of barking, short, sharp, urgent. Jonas shot up, coffee spilling across the table, and ran. There, she was at the inlet again. The sea behind her was churning, darker than before, as if something old was shifting beneath the surface. The dog paced now, ears high, hackles raised not in fear, but in warning. Jonas followed her line of sight. Farther down the beach, a group of teenagers were dragging a kayak toward the waterline, unaware, laughing. The dog barked again, and Jonas understood. This wasn't just about the wreck. It wasn't about closure. Something was active down there. Something that wasn't meant to be found or freed. He sprinted across the beach, waving his arms. Get back. Don't launch, he yelled, voice hoarse, cutting through wind and surf. The teens froze, startled. A moment later, a deep rumble rolled beneath the sand. Subtle but unmistakable. The ground trembled. The tide surged, and out beyond the trench, where the Evangeline slept, bubbles began to rise, not a trickle, a stream. A warning. Jonas turned to the dog. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was staring at the sea. Again. Still. Waiting. The old buoy clanged against the harbor piling as wind crept in from the east. Jonas stood at the edge of the dock, wetsuit half-sipped, fists clenched at his sides. His eyes kept returning to the dune where the dog had always waited. It was empty again 3 days in a row now. As if the moment they found what she'd been watching for, she had dissolved back into the salt and silence she came from. Jonas, Elsie called from the boat. We ready? He didn't answer right away. His chest was tight with something he hadn't dared name, regret maybe, or dread. The trench had revealed its secret, but it hadn't explained it. What they'd found down there wasn't a wreck, not in the way people expected. It was older, stranger. He finally climbed aboard. They rowed out in silence, past the rocks and gull cries and into deeper water, back to where the sonar had first pulsed with confusion. The team had dropped a beacon to mark the location, and now it blinked steadily in the surf like a heartbeat in open sea. Visibility's worse today, said Elsie, peering over the edge. Currents shifted. Jonas barely nodded. His mind was still caught on the shape they'd seen beneath the silt. The twisted hull, yes, but something else, too. A curve. A reflection that didn't belong. He'd dived for decades, explored caves, trained rescue teams. But this was different. The silence under that water wasn't just the kind that followed pressure and depth. It was listening. He didn't say any of this to the others. Not yet. They descended one by one, the bubbles of their breath rising like ghosts behind them as they dropped past the 30-foot mark. The trench opened again, and with it, that same eerie stillness, the kind that made you feel watched even with no eyes around. Elsie reached the site first and signaled. The shape was clearer today, some of the silt having drifted in the tide. What they saw confirmed what Jonas had suspected since the second dive. It was a small submersible, and it shouldn't have been there. The exterior bore markings, not military, not recreational, private, experimental, and cracked wide open, as if something from inside had forced its way out. Not in. Out. Jonas moved closer, brushing sediment from a small circular panel etched with characters. Not English. Not Russian. Something unreadable. He pressed a gloved finger against a latch near the cockpit. It hissed open. Inside was nothing. No body, no seat, just a harness. Shredded in 3 places, and deep in the footwell, wedged between tubing and sea debris, was something that made Jonas freeze. A child's plastic, hair-clipped, pink, butterfly-shaped, still intact. He stared at it, and that's when the sonar began to pulse again. Only this time, the beacon wasn't echoing off a structure. It was bouncing off movement. Below them, something alive. Jonas shot a signal up to the surface. 2 short bursts. Danger, but the water didn't feel dangerous. It felt ... aware. From the corner of his mask, he saw Elsie turning slowly, her body tense, hand resting on her dive light. The beams swept the trench walls and landed on a hollowed crevice just below the sub's tail. A tunnel, unnatural. Carved. Jonas pulled her back, sharply, but not before she caught a glimpse of something moving within it. A glimmer, a flicker of pale eyes in the dark. They didn't speak as they ascended. There was nothing to say. On the surface the wind had changed again. Colder, now sharper dot. They stripped their gear in silence. Back at the dock, the sky was sliding into a bruised twilight, the kind that made the sea look like it was swallowing light. Jonas didn't even bother to change out of his suit. He just walked barefoot, dripping down the path that curved toward the dunes. She was there, the dog, back in her place, still unmoving, staring at the water again, as if she'd never left. But this time she turned her head to him and held his gaze. It lasted only seconds, but it shook him, because in those eyes he didn't see the blank patience of an animal. He saw warning, grief, and something close to apology. Jonas stood frozen as the last sunlight disappeared behind the waves. Somewhere out beyond the inlet, something ancient and breathing shifted in the trench, waiting. And beneath the surface, the mystery wasn't buried. It had only just awakened. Jonas had always believed the sea held no secrets from him. He'd made peace with its temperaments, studied its shifts, even learned to read its silence. But now, standing barefoot in the dark, staring at the still figure of the dog beneath the moonlight, he understood how wrong he'd been. Some things the ocean didn't give back, not completely, and some things it never let go of at all. He crouched beside her in the sand, quietly. She didn't turn to look at him this time. Her eyes were locked on the water again, like they had always been. But something in her breathing had changed, slower now, more fragile, as if the thing she had waited for, watched for, warned against, had passed. "I saw it," Jonas whispered. "I don't know what it was, but I saw it, and I think you did too, long before anyone else did." The dog let out a small, trembled breath. She blinked once. Then, without fanfare, she laid her head down against the earth, her body curling into the shape of final rest. He didn't touch her. He just sat there listening to the tide roll in and out, like the long, steady rhythm of something eternal. By morning she was gone, no paw prints, no tracks, just a slight hollow in the sand where she had lain and the quiet, gentle hush of waves returning to shore. Jonas didn't speak about what they found in the trench again, not publicly. The authorities were vague when they sealed off the inlet, citing submerged hazards and unstable wreckage. The media tried to spin it into a story about a lost research pod and a missing family from decades ago, one that no one had cared to investigate until a diver stumbled across it by accident. But that wasn't the truth. Not all of it. The truth was there had been a presence beneath the water, a watching, waiting intelligence, one that hadn't forgotten the child who once clung to its metal ribs with a plastic butterfly clip in her hair, one that stood only when that story, that bond, that grief was remembered again, watched for, waited for, loved. Jonas left the coast a week later, sold the cottage, donated his dive gear, moved inland to a small house surrounded by trees. But every night before bed, he poured a bowl of water and placed it outside on the porch, beneath the stars. Not for a pet, not for superstition, but because he knew some things return, not always in the shape we remember, but in spirit. And if she did return, watching once more, waiting by some other shore, he wanted her to know someone had seen, someone had stayed, and someone had finally understood.